Hi everyone, thanks for coming back. In this video we're going to look at how to create an exposure and response prevention plan and how to practice exposure in a gradual and manageable way. In the last video we spoke about exposure and response prevention, or ERP, being the process of how we approach the things we would usually avoid, or the things that trigger our anxiety but without using our compulsive behaviours to give us relief. We spoke about the process of exposure being almost like riding a wave of anxiety that will rise and peak but will then come down naturally if we can prevent ourselves from alleviating these emotions artificially by using our compulsions. Over time and repetition of doing this, we learn that our compulsive behaviours are not what have protected us from harm and not what have kept us safe. We also allow ourselves the opportunity to test out the fears that we may have around what will happen if we don't respond to our thoughts. Over time, our brains learn that they no longer need to trigger a threat response in these situations, and our physical distress, our anxiety, and our fear of the situation begins to reduce. So we know the theory of ERP, but how do we do it? I'd like you to think for a moment about how you've learned to do something before that was new to you once upon a time. Perhaps something that you found difficult at one time in your life. Do you remember learning to drive for the first time, or how to swim? Did you get straight in a car and drive as fast as you could on a motorway? Did you jump straight off the top diving board into deep water? Probably not. The chances are you began practicing in situations which felt manageable. A quiet cul-de-sac, shallow water. The chances are that you practiced lots and lots in these situations before you took on anything more challenging. But over time, you likely introduced scarier and more challenging situations, deeper water, busier and faster roads. ERP is a similar process. Exposure should be a gradual and a manageable process, beginning with the more manageable tasks and building up to those that at the moment might seem unmanageable. We should begin with something that triggers some feelings of distress, but not something that is so overwhelming we're unlikely to go ahead with it or quit during the exposure. In a sense, the process of ERP should be like climbing a ladder, starting with the bottom rungs and the less challenging situations, building up progressively to the more challenging exposures on the higher rungs. With any exposure, there are a few tricks to success. Tip 1. Tackle only one step at a time and repeat this same exposure over and over again without using compulsions until our anxiety reduces. This is a bit like practicing driving the same stretch of quiet street over and over and over until we feel confident enough to try a busier street at a faster speed. Tip 2. Sit with emotions and wait for them to come down naturally. It's natural that we will feel anxious during exposure. After all, this is the reason we're doing it. However, we also want to be sure that even when we feel a surge of emotion or distress, that we don't stop the exposure at this point. If we stop the exposure when our distress is at a peak, all we do is reinforce an associated fear response. In other words, we strengthen our fear rather than reduce it. And we strengthen the belief that we were unable to cope with the distress we experienced. Physiologically, we're also more likely to experience a strong reaction the next time we try to do it. This is why it's so important during exposure to allow our distress to peak and to stick with it until our distress naturally starts to subside. Tip 3. Don't use your compulsions. Don't use your compulsions during or after an exposure. With all the exposure steps, we want to be sure that we're engaging in them without using our compulsions and making sure that we complete exposure cleanly every single time. Tip 4. Start small and build up. It's better to start small and with a less scary exposure and do it cleanly every time without using any compulsions, than to start with something too big and sometimes use compulsions and sometimes not. Tip 5. Repeat, repeat, repeat. With exposure, we want to repeat the exposure exercise until it no longer triggers strong emotional reaction for us. We'll know this when our anxiety has come right down. In other words, with exposure, feeling bored is good. Ultimately, if we're bored, we can't feel anxious. So where do we start planning and building an exposure hierarchy? Step 1. Generate ideas. Come up with as many situations you find yourself currently avoiding or using compulsive behaviour to currently cope with. For example, for someone who worries about being responsible for causing harm to others, they may experience anxiety triggered by turning appliances off or locking doors for fear that they might not have done this correctly. For this person, this anxiety likely drives compulsive checking behaviours, reassurance seeking, and causes them to avoid using certain appliances or even doing certain tasks. This person might begin by listing some of the triggering objects or environments, such as using the oven, using their iron, locking their car, or turning off the lights in their house at bedtime. These might be triggers that they either avoid completely, or triggers that they don't avoid but use repetitive checking or reassurance seeking to cope with. You might notice at this point that there are so many triggers to choose from you feel overwhelmed. So let's make this manageable by restricting this to no more than 10 ideas just now. Step 2. Make an idea about an exposure. The next step is to ask ourselves, what would it look like to deliberately expose ourselves to these triggers without using compulsive behaviour? For this person, it may be deliberately practicing setting their oven to a high temperature or using their iron before turning the appliance off and leaving the house. Similarly, rather than avoiding being the one to lock up their shared office and giving that task to someone else, they might deliberately try taking on this role and being the one to lock the door at night time, resisting any urges to recheck the lock or seek reassurance that they've done it correctly. If we also usually use magical rituals, we might want to think deliberately about doing the opposite to those rituals which currently feel safe. This can also be part of our exposure exercise. For example, if we always turn the lights off in the same order in the house, we might try deliberately mixing up this order, or even deliberately doing it back to front as part of our exposure practice. During this step, it helps to be as specific as possible about what we will do and exactly how we will do it. This makes sure we're not too tempted to use subtle forms of avoidance or variants of our old and familiar compulsions. Step 3. Rate each exposure step. The next stage will be to go through each of the exposures you have created and to give each of these steps a number out of 10. If 0 represented no anxiety at all and 10 represented the most anxious we could feel about doing something, which number would you give each of these steps? This number is sometimes known as our units of distress, or SUDs. Ideally, we want a range of steps, with SUDs between 5 and 10 out of 10. If the thought of carrying out an exposure step brings up SUDs which are less than 5, then it's likely we don't find the step challenging enough to learn much new from exposing ourselves to it. It may be that we have to adjust or tweak the steps we originally come up with to make them easier or more challenging. This way we will have an even spread of exposure steps to form the rungs of our exposure ladder or hierarchy. Step 4. Put the steps in an order. Once we have a number of steps with a range of SUD scores between 5 and 10, we want to order the steps from the lowest SUD score rating to the highest. This gives us a natural order and progression and forms our exposure ladder or hierarchy. So now we have an exposure hierarchy, we have a plan, we have a structure built of discrete and specific steps. Now all we have to do is actually do it and take notice of our experience. However determined and motivated you might feel to get things moving quickly, the key to exposure is pacing and doing each step cleanly. So start with the easiest step on your hierarchy and put all that determination and focus into this step only for now. As with anything, the more we practice, the quicker we learn and progress. If we only practice an exposure once or twice every few weeks, the chances are not much will change for us, mainly because we've got such a big gap in between our practices. This is the equivalent of taking one driving lesson a month as opposed to doing a crash course intensive lesson block where we have a lesson every day. Having a lesson once a month is fine, but it's going to take us a lot longer to learn how to drive. ERP is the same. To get results, we need to practice regularly, ideally at least once a day. Depending on the step we're targeting, we can create the opportunity to practice even more than this potentially. The rule is, the more we put in, the more we get back and the quicker we begin to see the results. As with anything that we become used to, it can be difficult to remember just how difficult it was at the beginning. And for this reason, it's really important to keep a log of your hard work and all your ERP practice. There's a simple and easy way to do this. With each exposure step we tackle, we want to record every time we practice it. Paying attention to our SUDS or our distress rating out of 10 is a good way to do this. By noticing and capturing our SUDS before, during and after an exposure gives us 3 separate ratings of distress that we can use to monitor whether this exposure is becoming easier for us to tolerate, or whether we need to keep practicing this particular step a little bit longer. It also helps us know when it's time to move on to the next step in our hierarchy. It can also be helpful to capture some of the thoughts or predictions that we might have about what could happen, and to balance these against the reality of what actually did happen when we conducted the exposure. It's likely the same old thoughts will show up for us time after time, but what will start to change as we practice is the intensity of these thoughts. Equally, as we practice, our SUDS will start to reduce. We'll begin to feel less distressed during exposures, and we'll also begin to find that our anxiety reduces more quickly. Once all of our SUDS scores are at a 5 or less out of 10, for before, during and after an exposure, this is usually a good indication that we're ready to move on to the next step in our hierarchy. Remember not to simply stop doing the previous steps you've worked on. The idea behind exposure is that we want to keep ticking over any completed steps, continuing to practice them regularly. But what does change is we begin to focus our concentrated efforts on the next steps. It's important to remember that there will be some steps that we breeze through and others which are tougher to crack. The important thing is not to give up or slip back into using avoidance or compulsions to cope. And if this does happen, don't beat yourself up. Notice and just gently guide yourself back to the right track. This might mean that we need to adjust some of the exposure steps as we go, breaking them down again and making them more manageable at times. That's absolutely fine. This is a flexible process. This is still progress as well. Remember, there's nothing wrong with readjusting if we need to. So, now we know how to build a hierarchy and how to record our exposure progress. All that remains now is to do it. Good luck everyone with the next steps on your journey to breaking your OCD cycle.